Hello everybody, I'm Hayk Minassian from Armenia. My presentation is devoted to two-photon absorption in titanium carbide MXene. This is a theoretical study and we try to interpret known experimental data. MXenes are two-dimensional structures and they are discovered 15 years ago in Drexel University in the United States. They are synthesized by etching aluminum layer in the MX phase that is presented in this slide. Usually after the etching, we have multi-layered MXene structures that can be further delaminated using different chemical reactions. And after the sonication, we receive single-layered MXenes that are composed of 3 layers of titanium and 2 layers of carbon. Usually, they have also terminations that appear during the synthesis of the MXene flakes. On the right side of the slide, you can see accordion-like multi-layered MXene structure, which was obtained by SEM. Let me present shortly the important physical properties of MXenes that make them attractive for several applications. First of all, they can be used in constructing supercapacitors. The point is that multi-layered MXene structures can be used to collect large amount of charges after removing of aluminum from the MX phase. The other application of MXene is connected with high electric conductivity. In addition to that, also the optical properties demonstrate some peculiarities. In particular, it turns out that MXenes are plasmonic particles. Also, it was demonstrated many times that MXenes absorb the whole visible spectrum of light, which makes them important for constructing devices for electromagnetic shielding. All these properties, in fact, can be used in constructing new optoelectronic devices. I should mention that whereas the linear optical properties of MXenes are well studied, still there are unclear problems connected with nonlinear optical properties of these new structures. Particularly, I'm talking about nonlinear absorption of light in MXenes that can be connected with various processes, particularly two-photon absorption. In this slide, I present 3 different experiments made using different lasers, and we see that the transmission depends on intensity more or less in the same way. At low intensity, we see that there is a saturation of the absorption, which is a well-known nonlinear effect in optics. But the interesting part is connected with higher intensities. We see that after the saturation of the absorption, the transmission goes down at several levels. This means that at higher intensities after the saturation of the absorption, again, new absorption process starts. And this is the thing that should be explained. In the experimental studies, the authors usually present the idea of reverse saturable absorption, which means that after the saturation of the one-photon processes, we have two-photon absorption, and this is why with the intensity the absorption again goes up. The simplest way to explain nonlinear absorption process in quantum systems is a two-level atomic system approximation, which is presented in this slide, and the corresponding absorption is described by the simple formula presented on the right side. At high enough intensities, we have a saturation process, which is connected with the simple fact that the populations in these two levels, 0 and 1, come close to each other, and this is why we do not have the absorption, and it is clearly demonstrated in this formula. And the coefficient I saturation is a certain intensity at which the absorption coefficient becomes 2 times less as compared to the linear absorption. It's just a characteristic of the nonlinear absorption. Now, the problem is that usually this simple formula is used in solid-state physics to describe nonlinear optical processes. On the other hand, we know that the solids are too far from two-level atomic system, and to describe the quantum processes in these systems, we have to start from the consideration of band structure. In this slide, a band structure of the MXene is presented, and actually this is a dependence of the energy of the electrons in MXene depending on the wave vector. We see that at the gamma point of Brillouin zone, we have several maxima, both above the Fermi level and below the Fermi level. This means that several transitions can take place resonantly. To explain the known experimental data, actually, we will use highly this band structure. Let us consider the wavelength 1550 nanometer. This is the wavelength which was used to measure the nonlinear absorption coefficient in MXene. Here, I present some transitions that correspond to these wavelengths. By these black arrows, I show the interband direct transitions between valence band, which is denoted as V2, and conduction band, which is denoted as C. And this energy exactly is 0.8 electron volt, which corresponds to the wavelength presented here. So definitely here we have resonance one photon absorption. And it is clear that with the increasing of the intensity, we should have here the saturation of one photon absorption. But in addition to this, we found out that there is another valence band, which is denoted as V1. It has rather big effective mass, which means that the density of state in this band is large enough to be important for nonlinear transitions. And in fact, we see that here we have another one photon absorption from band V1 to V2. But this can take place only if there are free states of electrons in the band V2. This is important peculiarity, because as you will see later, actually this mechanism probably the dominant to explain the existing experimental data. Also, in principle, it might happen that we can have direct two-photon absorption process from the band V1 to band C, and it is shown in blue arrows. This also we'll discuss later on. As I mentioned, all experimental data show that linear absorption of light in the visible range of the spectrum is almost constant. It's a large value, and it doesn't depend on the frequency of incident light. We made corresponding calculations for the one-photon absorption coefficient. Here you see the result. As it is expected, the dependence of linear absorption on the frequency has a form of square root. Now, if we increase the intensity of light, the one-photon absorption starts to be dependent on the intensity, which is a nonlinear process. To make calculations, we used our previous results that were developed for direct band gap semiconductors, where we have shown that the behavior of the saturation seriously differs from that of two-level atomic system. Here you see the results for the nonlinear absorption coefficient, and you see that there is no need of the introduction of any fitting procedures because the intensity, saturation intensity here is just calculated where all characteristics describe the media itself. Here we have, for instance, the different relaxation times. We have the matrix element of the dipole transition between two actual bands, V2 and C. And also, there is a dependence, naturally, on the wavelengths of the incident light. After the calculation of one photon absorption in nonlinear regime, there is a need to calculate also the second order process, since in the experimental papers, the authors mentioned that they had two-photon absorption between different bands in MXene. To calculate the two-photon absorption, we use standard second order of perturbation theory. And the probability for this transition is written here. The probability is connected with the coefficient of two-photon absorption beta by this formula. It is written here. After getting the data for the second two-photon absorption coefficient, it is easy now to solve the propagation equation for the intensity in z direction. Here we have two terms on the right side. The first one is linear absorption if the intensity is small enough, but also we might have some two-photon absorption as well. Since we know that in the range of intensity that are investigated in the experiments, we had the saturation of one photon absorption. We must correct this equation and put, instead of linear absorption, nonlinear one photon absorption, which is written here in the second equation. To be more clear, here I put the function of alpha I that was calculated by us. So solution of this equation was compared to the experimental data. And unfortunately, it turned out that this equation does not describe well the nonlinear absorption process in MXene. very specifically, we got for the absorption coefficient using this formula the data that are far from the experiment. So we come to the conclusion that in these nonlinear experiments, most probably there were some other mechanisms of transitions that provided the absorption measured at different wavelengths. Since conventional two-photon absorption process did not bring us to close to experimental data results, we have to find some other alternatives to describe nonlinearity in this case. As I mentioned earlier, on this band diagram, we see that there is a possibility of one photon direct interband transitions between V1 and V2. But this process can take place only in the case when there are free states in the band V2. In fact, it happens thanks to the saturation of the one photon absorption between bands V2 and C. This definitely means that we cannot use anymore the standard distribution functions of the carriers such as Fermi-Dirac distribution, because now the density of states depends also on the intensity of external light. And this is a peculiarity that has to be taken into account. The corrected distribution function for the electrons for the transitions between V1 and V2 is presented here. This function now depends on the intensity of external light, and also it depends on various relaxation times. FV1 and FV2 in the nominator of this expression are the values for the distribution functions that are not disturbed by the external field. Now we can use this distribution function to calculate the one photon direct resonance transitions between the bands V1 and V2. Thus, the problem of many zones or bands of MXene now is reduced to three-band model, in the frame of which we want to describe nonlinearity. Since we consider only three bands, we have to assume that the total concentration of the carriers in three bands must be constant. But of course, thanks to the different transitions, the population of each band will be changed. To have a picture of the densities of carriers in all these three actual bands, we have to solve the rate equations, which are written here. Thus, we have to solve the rate equations in three-band model, but with special initial conditions. The point is that usually in three-level atomic system, we have occupied one level, the other two are free, and we consider different transitions between three atomic levels. In this case, the situation is completely different. The point is that below Fermi level, the bands at the beginning of the process are occupied. This means that we have a special case when two bands out of three at the beginning of the process are occupied, and only one band, which is C, is free. So we take into account these initial conditions and solve the rate equations numerically. So the result is shown here in the graph. The red line corresponds to the C band, The green band corresponds to the V2 band, and the blue line corresponds to the band V1, the lowest band. We see, first of all, that at very high intensities, we have equal occupation probabilities for all three bands, and this is the situation when we have no absorption at all. All two one-photon transitions are fully saturated. But for lower intensities, we have different pictures, and this is interesting point, that at the beginning, we know that one-photon resonance transition between the bands V2 and C is saturated, and only after that, the other one-photon resonance transition starts, which is connected with the process when the electron jumps from the band V1 to band V2. And this is possible because, as I mentioned earlier, we have some free states in the band V2 near the Fermi level. And it changes the whole picture of the absorption, because it turns out that even at not very high intensity, still we have a dependence on intensity of the absorption. To get the general picture of the absorption in three-band model, we also studied the steady state solution of the rate equations. For that, we just neglected the time derivatives of the populations, and we calculated the populations in three bands that show that the mostly populated band is the lowest one, and the less populated one is the highest band, and that's natural result. But besides that, we see that with the increase of intensity, there are changes that show that there is a range of intensities where the nonlinear absorption after the saturation can again increase. After having calculated the intensity-dependent distribution function, which is written in this slide, we see that it depends on intensity, and the intensity dependence is both on numerator and in denominator. Now, if we consider the range of intensities where the expression gamma multiplied by the sum of the relaxation time is much less than 1, and it can take place for the certain relaxation times. In this case, in the denominator of the expression 1, we neglect the dependence on intensity, and we get here the linear dependence of the intensity-dependent distribution function on intensity. And if this is the case, then the absorption coefficient in that range of intensities approximately can be presented as linear absorption multiplied by the function that is a distribution function that depends on the intensity. And since the function f has a linear dependence on the intensity, we get the final answer for the absorption, which is also linearly dependent on the intensity. And this is exactly the result that was demonstrated for the reverse saturable absorption region in the experimental graph presented on the right side of this slide. And in conclusion, we have demonstrated that at the first stage of the absorption, we have one photon saturable absorption in MXene when the transitions take place between the bands V2 and C. After reaching the stage of the full saturation, we have free spaces in the band V2. That is why another channel of the transitions opens, which is one photon transition between the band V1 and V2. And this is the region where the absorption coefficient increases linearly with the intensity. It is clear that this cannot continue for very large intensities because, as in case of the first stage, here also we should have a saturation of this transition, but we do not have, unfortunately, experimental data for very high intensities to have also that picture. Thank you.